The following is a non-profit fan reading that is not officially associated with Neil Peart, his family, his publisher, or the other members of Rush. Out of respect for the author, the entirety of the original text will not be presented here. If you would like to learn more about Neil Peart, his written works, or the music of Rush, please click the links in the description.
Chapter 4. West to Alaska. The sun came out by the time I made the Arctic Red River ferry, and the day remained bright and dry. Though I had to curse the water truck I had to follow through the same construction area where I had fallen the previous day. In the early afternoon, I reached the halfway point, Eagle Plains, and knew the worst was behind me. I decided to stop there for the night and get some rest, and as I checked in, I said to the man at the front desk, "Yesterday, this seemed like wilderness. Today, it seems like civilization." At sunset, I poured a glass of whiskey and walked outside to enjoy the spectacular view, looking far over rolling billows of green, gray, and dark red. Peace settled over the land as the wind fell off at last, for that ceaseless, roaring wind had felt harsh and chaotic, at least to my little baby soul. In Bruce Chatwin's song lines, he writes about an Australian who goes crazy and starts shooting the wind, and I could always relate to that, especially when I was battling a headwind on a bicycle, but even when I was just trying to be still. Leaving Eagle Plains early on a sunny morning, the rest of the way back to Dawson passed fairly quickly through the low forest dotted with crimson and yellow and the sharp-etched gray mountains. Still pools near the road reflected the clear sky, and I noticed ice around their edges, though I felt cool rather than cold. Getting used to it, I decided. Or getting used to wearing all my clothes. With more confidence and less concern about fuel conservation, I made it back to Dawson in an hour less than the 6 it had taken going out, though I did have to use my spare can of gas. However, I noted, that's what it's there for. In Dawson, I stopped for a quick sandwich at Nancy's, then found a payphone to call the BMW dealer in Fairbanks, hoping to make an appointment for a couple of days for new tires, an oil change, a look at the front brake pads, and some damage repair. The voice on the phone was gruff and laconic, and when I told him I was traveling his way and wanted to get some service work done, he growled, "Left it a bit late, didn't you?" Thinking he meant I should have called him sooner for an appointment, I told him I had just arrived back in Dawson, and was only now able to predict when I might be able to get back to Fairbanks. "No," he said, "I mean late in the season." "Well," I said, "this is when I got here. It's September now, you know. It could snow any day. What are you going to do then?" "Well, load the bike on a truck and haul it out, I guess. I don't know." I began to think of him as Mr. Dismal, though time would prove me wrong. His manner was only the voice of the old Alaska hand, impatient with naive travelers from down south. When I mentioned my concern about the front brake pads, he asked the year of the bike. I told him it was 3 years old, and he said he didn't think they could be worn yet. Then he asked, how many miles on it? And when I told him just over 40,000, his tone softened. "Oh, you're a rider. A real rider." Evidently, I was now worthy of respect, and he agreed to do what he could for me when I arrived in Fairbanks. I rode down the Yukon River and caught the ferry across, then headed up to the Top of the World Highway. I'd been skeptical about that name, thinking it was maybe another northern exaggeration like highway often was, and by top of the world they only meant so far north. But the hyperbole was justified. The narrow paved road twisted along the top of the high ridge with sweeping views on either side, looking down steep green mountain slopes and far off to distant ranges of purple and gray. It truly felt like the top of the world, and I decided it was one of the most spectacular roads I had ever traveled. Banking smoothly into the corners with the revs up high and the bike down low, looking ahead through the turn for the proper apex, and the occasional scattering of gravel, I reflected that this was more like the sport of motorcycling, as opposed to the survival course of something like the Dempster. Though I confess that having made it all the way to Inuvik and back, I felt a little proud, in a foolish sort of way. The paving gave way to graded gravel near the Alaska border, where I stopped at a temporary-looking prefab building, a seasonal summer-only frontier, and switched off the engine to talk to the friendly officer. Riding away with a stamp in my passport reading Poker Creek, Alaska, I had finally managed to visit all 50 of the United States. During the 23 years of touring, Rush had performed in the other 49. I had even bicycled in about 40. And during the Test for Echo tour, Brutus and I had managed to ride our motorcycles through 47 of the lower 48. But up until then, I had never made it up to Alaska, so this too made me a little proud, in a foolish sort of way. I was now on the Taylor Highway, Jackie and Selena's last name, alas. Another overstated title for a winding gravel road leading down through forested mining country, including the tiny settlement of Chicken, and back to the Alaska Highway, which, after 3 days of dirt roads, I described as plush. On the last stretch, I began to see big RVs parked at the roadside, often with a trailer of ATVs with rifle cases. The caribou migration was just beginning in this area, and the hunters could park their luxurious rigs nearby, climb on their ATVs, drive right up to the migration route, and ready aim fire, all without having to even stand up. Never mind the discomforts of stalking elusive prey through the bush. Personally, I've never been against the idea of hunting game that is plentiful and good to eat, especially when it is actually eaten. But I was a little disenchanted with these sportsmen. That's not hunting, I wrote. That's just shooting. In the hotel bar that night, I heard a man say to his neighbor that hunting was our national heritage, and that hunters replaced the natural predators like bears and wolves that had been wiped out. Although it might be argued that those predators had been wiped out by hunters, there was some truth to that claim. But it still sounded like the sort of self-serving rationalization the lumber companies used in claiming that harvesting, the forest offered the benefits of naturally occurring forest fires. In the little crossroads town of Toke, the Westmark Hotel ought to have been a pretty quiet Wednesday night destination. But once again, I was in bus tour land, and the bar and restaurant were packed with the name-tag-wearing crowd of middle-aged, overweight, loud-voiced tourists. I squeezed into a stool at the bar for a quick dinner of margarita and enchiladas, then slipped off to my room for an early sleep, waking several times during the night with an upset stomach and troubled dreams. I rode out of Toke very early on another cold morning, this one punctuated by intervals of sun, clouds, and spatters of rain. The highway to Fairbanks led me through green and yellow forest with snow-covered peaks, and once, a cow moose trotted across the road ahead. Making Fairbanks by noon, I took a quick ride around the downtown area and pulled up at the visitor's center behind the Chenna River. After a scan of the brochures for local lodgings, I settled on another of the Westmark chain, this one a large, modern-looking place. Checked in, bags dropped, I set off to get the bike looked after. Trails End BMW was on the farthest edge of town behind a grove of tall conifers, and at first, it seemed like the image of a trapper's cabin, with an old house trailer built onto it. Under the trees to one side, a rustic shelter covered a few new bikes and older sidecar bits and pieces. George, the owner, salesman, mechanic, parts manager, and gruff voice on the telephone, was a grizzled old prospector type, though with neatly trimmed beard and mustache, and he was friendly in his somewhat laconic, distracted manner. Though obviously very knowledgeable about all things BMW, he seemed scattered, so that I often had the disconcerting feeling he was chasing his own thoughts and hardly hearing what I said. When I pulled the luggage cases off the bike and made it easier to work on, and asked where I could put them, George pulled open the creaky door of a dilapidated pickup, shoved some stuff aside and said, "It'll be okay in here." He offered me a ride back to the hotel in his vintage BMW sidecar outfit, which would have been a new experience for me, but the bike wouldn't run. "Water in the carbs," he said, and drove me in his old diesel Mercedes instead. Fairbanks seemed a pleasant little city, with about 30,000 friendly people, judging by the ones I met while walking the downtown streets and poking around the shops for stickers and postcards. When Brutus and I traveled together, we often sought out these colorful and sometimes nostalgic souvenir stickers as small and easily carried mementos. And on this trip, I was starting to use that quest as an excuse to go out and look around. Another mission on my past travels had been sending a postcard to my grandfather, who was in his 90s and confined to a home. After Selena's funeral, Gramps had whispered in my mother's ear, "Tell Neil to run for the woods." And though I wasn't able to follow that advice at the time, I was certainly running for the woods now. Back at the hotel, I did some laundry, sent off a few cards, and had an excellent meal downstairs at the Bear and Seal Grill. Despite the other scars that afflicted me, my enthusiasm for fine dining and drinking seemed to be intact. By the middle of the following morning, true to his word, George had the bike ready, and I set off for Anchorage with fresh oil and various parts adjusted or tightened. George had showed me the brake pad still had some life, and I was also reassured by the solid, resilient feel of new tires between me and the highway. Just outside Fairbanks, I stopped to look at huge flocks of sandhill cranes feeding in a stretch of open land, gathering for their southward migration, and just after that, the bike's odometer ticked off 10,000 kilometers of my own migration, 6,000 miles in 2 weeks. Continuing south, along that final stretch of the Alaska Highway, the sky seemed full of mountains on every side, dominated by the white peak of Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, after a president who never set foot in Alaska. At 2,370 feet, Denali is the highest peak in North America, and the national park that surrounds it had taken a brave step into the future of America's overcrowded parks by closing its roads to tourist traffic and offering shuttle buses to deliver campers and hikers to their trailheads. Compared with the noxious competition between parading vehicles and unspoiled nature in such American national parks as Yellowstone, Yosemite, or the Grand Canyon, this was obviously a good thing, but it did mean that the entrance and parking areas were jammed with cars, trailers, minivans, campers, and RVs, so I gave up on the idea of making a spontaneous tour of the park. In any case, Anchorage lay ahead at the end of the Alaska Highway, and that destination had the lure of a name that seemed almost mythical. So I was content to escape the crowds and continue south towards the coast, riding down into a valley of farms and pasture lands, a rare part of Alaska with sufficiently fertile soil and mild weather to permit agriculture. Yet another facet of Alaska's diversity. And while I rode that day, I was thinking how diminished the United States would be without Alaska. In the same way the Canadian worldview is profoundly affected by the vast areas of the true north, which are nearly unpopulated, our notion of home is clearly molded by the places where we don't live. Most Americans seldom reflect that their mental image of their country includes the prairies, the Rockies, the desert Southwest, the stonewalled fields of New England, the Pacific Northwest, the distant islands of Hawaii, and the wilds of Alaska. So much of the American character, or at least self-image, was built upon the reality and the ideal of the frontier. And even for that vast majority of Americans who might never visit the last frontier, the very idea of Alaska must shine as part of their sense of possibility, and a remote outpost in their psychological geography. Just to know there's still a part of their country that isn't all filled up or all used up. Though, maybe not for long. It should come as no surprise that a creeping industrialization is inexorably devouring that wilderness too, in the guise of oil exploration, drilling, mining, refining, and logging. And the center of that commercial vortex was Anchorage. With over 200,000 people, it was the metropolis of Alaska, 7 or 8 times larger than Fairbanks, which in turn is more populous than the state capital of Juneau. Though the Los Anchorage sobriquet might be exaggerated by a magnitude of about 15, everything is relative. After 2 weeks of riding across the wild prairie mountain ranges and the open lands of the Arctic, Anchorage certainly felt like a city as I cruised the busy streets for an hour to get my bearings. However, like Vancouver or Seattle, the urban face of concrete, glass, and steel was softened by the frame of its natural setting, the sparkling blue of the Cook Inlet, and tall mountains all around. Continuing my inexplicable attraction to the Westmark chain, I think because it was more or less a local chain, this one a high-rise, I got in just ahead of the bus tour groups. As I was unpacking in my room, the front desk attendant called to warn me not to leave my camping gear and sleeping bag on the bike, as I usually did. I asked him, "Do you think anyone would bother stealing that?" "It's Saturday night in Anchorage, sir," he said. "They'll take everything." Later that night, I lay awake in my dark hotel room, listening to the hooting and braying of drunken revelers in the streets and feeling low. An innocent, smiling memory so often leads that way. Seeing a family traveling together, some old TV show, hearing an old song, or a flute piece that Selena used to play coming over the restaurant's muzak. So many connections. The little port of Haines would prove to be my definitive Alaskan experience. I stopped at a small liquor store to look for a bottle of single malt whiskey, and I overheard a fisherman telling the owner about the 49-pound halibut he had just caught. On his way out the door, he pointed down towards Main Street, a few blocks away, where a black bear was loping across the road. A few other travelers seemed to be biding their time there too, mostly older retired couples, and they soon began talking among themselves from table to table, comfortable among strangers so like themselves, from the same generation of friendly, open Americans. I overheard one of the men trying to remember the name of a small town away up north in the Northwest Territories, right on the Arctic Ocean. One younger couple was moving from Anchorage to Reno, and one lady recalled how she and her husband had last been to Las Vegas in 1958, and she imagined it was a lot different now. One of the men asked the waitress about the local salmon fishing, and she told how she had won the salmon derby the previous year, catching a 44-pounder that had netted her $1,600, a 3-day trip to Juneau, a $350 fishing rod, and a free dinner in Whitehorse. After dinner, I took a slow ride around the inlet, and at the top, where the Chilkoot River flowed in, I saw a few people standing on a small bridge. I slowed to see what they were looking at, then stopped and switched off the engine. Straddling the bike, I watched 5 grizzly bears at the river's edge, a sow with 3 cubs and 1 half-grown. Not as big as they get, but pretty big. A young Australian passed me his binoculars, and I got a close-up view of them feeding on the dead salmon. These coastal grizzlies were referred to as brown bears, and as a result of this bountiful diet of salmon, they were considerably larger than their mountain-dwelling cousins. At the ferry dock, I pulled the bike into the center stand in the line of waiting vehicles, took out Jack London's The Sea Wolf, and relaxed in the saddle, leaning back against my duffel with my legs up on the cylinder heads. As darkness fell, the smell of the sea seemed to grow stronger, and a brief glimpse of full moon was overtaken by clouds. Rain began to fall with growing intensity, so I took shelter under the terminal overhang for a while and walked around in my rain suit. I passed a young woman out walking her little dog, and she looked pretty under the lights of the rain-washed parking lot. She gave me a smile that seemed to go right through me, the way that girls can sometimes do, and I suddenly felt galvanized, dumb, nervous, and afraid. Pretty girls have always tended to have that effect on me, on the rare occasions I was confronted by one, but I hadn't felt any of those kinds of feelings for a long time. Perhaps in line with an earlier soliloquy about unimagined affection, I never felt I was particularly attractive to women, but something seemed different now. Later when I was around friends, they would confirm I suddenly seemed to attract a certain attentiveness from women. Even though I still wore my wedding ring, as Jackie and I both had, despite being unsanctioned by church and state, and sure wasn't sending out any conscious signals. Waitresses rested their fingers lightly on my arm, cashiers gave me sympathetic smiles, women on the street sometimes poured their eyes into mine. Taking the romantic view, I like to imagine their feminine radar could detect the air of tragedy, which must surely have surrounded me like an aura. Maybe it was just the more prosaic air of availability, or the line that Tom Robbins translates from Baudelaire, "Women love these fierce invalids home from hot climates." This pretty girl on the ferry dock in Haines, Alaska looked to be traveling alone with her little dog, and if she was sending me some kind of signal, what should I do? Was this one of those opportunities I should think about, or just an overactive imagination? Whatever it was, I was not ready to deal with it, and when I didn't see her again aboard the ship, I put the question out of my mind. Apparently, though, my little baby soul was harboring a spark of response to life other than highways, landscapes, and wildlife.